Here we are, ready for our last piece of the elements of art. We've studied 6 so far in our artwork. Most of them were done in our spray paint artwork. We did one last week as well. Let's go through the hand motions. Do them along with me. Let's see if we can remember all 6 that we've talked about so far. We've talked about line, shape, form, color, value, the lightness or darkness of a color. And last week we talked about space, where we put things in our artwork. This week we're going to talk about texture, or how something feels. And that's all 7 elements of art. Let's practice them one more time together. Line, shape, form, color, value, space, and texture. All right, texture is how something feels. Take a moment and feel the shirt that you're wearing. Think about how it might feel. Soft, fuzzy, rough, silky, smooth. Compare it to how the pants feel that you have on. Maybe you have on a skirt or leggings. If you have on jeans like me, my pants are a little more rough in texture than my shirt. Can feel my hair. It has a different texture than my face. You can compare those textures. Textures is how something feels, but how does that apply to artwork? We're going to look at a couple of examples, and then we're going to do our own texture study about some things that we find in the environment around us. Let me show you a couple of pictures of texture in artwork. The first one is this beautiful statue. It's carved out of wood. The artist's name is Donatello. He was an Italian artist. And you can tell that the artist Donatello tried to represent the texture in real life on his artwork. You can tell in the clothes and the hair that they would feel different than the skin, the arms, or the face would feel. And while sculpture kind of makes sense, because you could actually touch it if you were in the same room with it and feel the different textures, it's not the literal texture of hair, right? He had to represent it on his artwork. Here's another example. This is from the 18th century. This is the head of Oba. It's what they call this piece of artwork. It's a sculpture. And if you look, this cording around the neck actually looks woven. And because of that, in my head, I just feel like it would have a little bit of roughness to it. Then look at the netting that's over the head. I can kind of imagine how that might feel. It would definitely feel different than the ornament that's around the neck. And the hair would be a totally different texture. And again, just this smooth, reflective look of the skin tells my eye that it would be smooth as opposed to the rough texture of the other parts of the artwork. So in sculpture, it kind of makes sense that there would be texture. There would be these different feelings because they're 3-dimensional and you could actually feel them, but it's still just an artist's representation of what it would have been in real life. What happens though when we move to a 2-dimension? That would be our flat sheets of paper, a canvas, a 2-dimensional way to show texture. Here's a couple of my favorites. This is a painting by Ralph Goings. It was made in the 1980s. This is actually called Ralph's Diner. And if you look at the reflection on all these surfaces, looks like most everything has a very smooth texture. That chrome that's around the edge of the counter, the leather that's over the seats, the ceiling and the way that it's reflecting the light from the windows all make my eye, as the viewer, feel like there's a lot of smooth surfaces in this diner. Here's another. This is the artist. I'm going to look at it so I make sure I say his name right. Durer. He is one of my favorite artists to study, Albrecht Dürer. This picture is actually called Young Hare, and you can totally imagine what this rabbit feels like. It just looks so luxurious and soft. And you can tell that the fur on the ears would probably feel different than the fur on the body by the way that Mr. Dürer shows texture. And you could even feel the texture of the whiskers. I just can imagine it in my mind. If you look at some of his other artworks, he does some beautiful portraits. You can see the texture of the skin and the hair. He has such a beautiful job of showing texture and realism in his artwork. So these are all examples of implied texture. The artist has implied that there is texture in their artwork, even though if you were to go and feel the canvas that this rabbit has been painted on, it's not going to feel like the rabbit actually feels. It's not even going to feel like the rabbit looks. It's implied texture. So today in our lesson, we're going to be going through some different textures. We're going to practice, we're going to experiment a little with how things might feel and how we could show that texture in our artwork. So the things that you're going to need today: one sheet of paper and a pencil. That's it. You want a graphite, a pencil that can be sharpened. You don't want a mechanical pencil for this because we're going to use actually the side of our lead and not the point. So if you don't have a pencil like this that you could sharpen, then you could use your colored pencils. That would work. If you have crayons, you could use crayons. It would be fine to do this project in color if you wanted to. I like the look of the graphite. This is graphite on the paper because then my brain doesn't get confused with all the color, but there's nothing wrong with using color. And if you have something like this milk lid handy, this would be helpful because we're going to be making circles on our paper. It's not necessary. You can draw the circles too. All right, let's look at my example for just a moment here. Let's see how many circles I want you to draw on your paper. We'll do a little math together, okay? If I have 3 circles on each line and I have 4 lines, so I have 4 groups of 3, then I have 3, 6, 9, 12. Or I could say 3 times 4. So I want us to put 12 circles on our paper. I've started putting the circles on mine, so you didn't have to watch me draw all of them, but I simply took my milk lid. Doesn't have to be this exact size, but something around this size. If you don't have a milk lid, that is no problem. Do your light sketching lines until you get the circle that you like, and then you can edit or erase the lines that you don't need. That works just as well. All right, so we've got 12 circles on our paper. Go ahead, you can pause the video and make sure that you get 12 circles on your paper as well. All right, so we all have our circles. We're going to take a moment. At the top of your paper, I'd like for you to write texture study. A lot of times in art, especially so far, we've been doing project-based work, but this time we're going to be studying. We're going to be experimenting and practicing. I wanted you guys to feel the freedom to try out a few things today without artwork being in the balance. But we will use this paper in the future on a project where we add texture. So I want you to keep it in your art portfolio with your other work so we can pull it back out and look at it again. All right, in our first 3 circles, we're going to actually do texture rubbings. We're going to place our paper over something that has texture that we can feel, and we're going to use our pencil to rub over the top and make the texture appear on our paper. This is a form of printmaking or relief making. Here's a couple of pointers. You're not going to hold your pencil the same way you do to write because that's using the point of your pencil. Today we want to use the side of the lead. So I'm actually going to hold my pencil. I'm going to grip it between these 2 fingers and hold it to the side. Let me show you 3 examples and then I will let you guys go and find a few yourself. Remember that as we do this, we are drawing on our paper, not on the objects that we're finding. Here's an object that a lot of us have nearby. Maybe you're using it right now. The lid to these Chromebooks has a lot of texture to them. So I'm going to put my paper over it to protect it so I'm not drawing on top. And I'm going to do a rubbing. Oh, it really comes through nicely. I can see the texture of this piece of equipment coming through onto my paper. So my paper now visually has the texture of this Chromebook. Here's a couple of other examples. I happen to have this nearby too, a Lego plate. Let me use the edge of my pencil. can actually hear the texture on this one as I'm rubbing it. Makes the bumpy texture of the Lego plate. All right, I could do the table that I'm working on is wood and has a very definite texture to it. And that's why I have to work on this black sheet of paper so it doesn't show up on my paper. So that would be another option. Here's something I collected from outside. This is a leaf. I just flipped it over to the back side. You guys may have done this before. I'm going to do a rubbing of the leaf. Those lines start to appear. I think the leaf is especially neat because it's actually very smooth to the touch, except for these ridges that look so cool. And if you go over it sometimes in two different directions, you pick up even more of that texture to the leaf. So while the leaf is very smooth in these parts that look very smooth, then you have these bumpy ridges. All right, so now it's your turn. I want you to fill just the first three with rubbings of texture around your room. Don't forget, like the carpet, your table, those can all work. Okay, pause the video and head out to do that. All right, so we have our first three circles filled with rubbings of texture. Let's try drawing texture next. We're going to use our first element of art on all three, which is line. We're going to draw. We're going to do this together while we're talking. So we're going to draw little short lines. I like to draw them in little groups, 3 or 4 or 5. We're just making little sharp staccato lines. What would you call this texture? How would you describe it? What adjectives would you use? The first ones that come to mind for me are spiky, maybe prickly, something you'd find on a cactus, or it could be like dog's fur, a very short-haired dog. These are all headed in the same direction, but let's experiment a little. We'll turn our paper a little. What if you send those lines going in a different direction? Does it change your texture? It doesn't necessarily. Doesn't have to be an automatic yes. But let's just spend a little time exploring what this could be. This would be called movement. When we change the direction of lines, the viewer's eye has to change direction while it's looking. It picks up on that, kind of shows movement in the picture. In this case, I don't think it changes the texture, but it does make for a pretty interesting picture. Definitely looks like fur on an animal now, how it turns direction sometimes. All right, so we have our prickly, short texture. We're going to use line again. We're going to make the line medium-sized, and instead of making it straight, we're going to make it curved. So what if we made medium-sized curved lines? It's already looking softer than our first sample. Fill up this section. And again, what if, let's play also with direction. So we've changed our line, we've made it curved and a little bit longer. What if we turn our paper again? Does movement or changing the direction change what we see? Not really. It does make it interesting again. All right. So we do have prickly. What adjectives would you use to describe this? I don't feel like I have a super creative adjective right now. I think I would just say softer. Compared to the other, it looks softer. All right, so in this last one, let's make our lines even bigger and even more of a curve. And I'm going to overlap these maybe a little bit more because they're longer. They don't fill the space quite the same. And definitely going to change direction. Do some going the other way. You could even make almost a complete circle if you wanted. And I would say that this is definitely looking softer. This longer curved line looks the softest of these three. Kind of reminds me of a soft ball of fur. Something that, a dust bunny that I might find under the table. All right, so we have this prickly, we have softer, and we have fluffy soft. All right, so those are three, and we just simply use lines. We're gonna go a little bit deeper now. On these next three, let's try in this first one to make something smooth. So I'm going to use the side of my pencil. It's not quite how I would write with. I'm using the edge of my lead, and I'm going to let these little sections overlap. When I let them overlap, I'm creating value in the graphite, the pencil lead. So I have light value where it's really light, but when my pencil overlaps, I'm starting to see that it's creating areas of darker value. I'm going to go back. I don't know if it's showing up as well, but I'm going to go back to these areas where my pencil mark overlaps, and I'm going to darken them. This is kind of starting to look like that reptile pattern. I would say that reptiles feel smooth, but they definitely have a little texture to them. So as I look at this, I start to feel the texture, the somewhere between smooth, but it definitely has some roughness to it. Okay, let's try this next circle. Let's do smooth again. This time, don't let your pencil marks overlap. So I'll kind of do this section, and then I'll go up and do this one, but I'm being very careful not to overlap as much. I'm going a little lighter. Might make it a little harder to see in the video, but hopefully not. You know, all of my lines are going the same way, which kind of makes the viewer's eye see the line. So I'm actually going to turn my paper and go the opposite way now over the top. This will help have a little more uniformed value or color to it. This is called cross-hatching. Cross-hatching is sometimes very bold. This is a very light version of cross-hatching, but I think we achieved a soft look to it. All right, to add one more layer of softness, here we added a darker value to create texture. This one will add a highlight, a lighter value. Just going to erase two small curved lines. This makes this sample look smoother because my eye is seeing the way that the light would reflect on it in these highlights or hot spots, and it's telling my eye that this is a very smooth surface, maybe something like glass. If this were a marble, the light would hit from here, but it would also be bouncing off the surface on the bottom, and you would get a tiny small highlight on the bottom too. All right, so we have this reptile look, we have smooth. Let's try something with pattern, but also using this idea of value. I'm going to make small curved lines in a row. And I'm just going to continue these side by side until I filled up my space. This would be something maybe that was woven. It reminds me of a basket or a mat that I have here beside me. And it just has this, it's a smooth texture, but it's one of those smooth and rough, kind of like this reptile feel to it. All right, and after I filled this up, my pattern and these curved lines have created a texture. Then I'm going to go back in between these lines and just darken it a little. I'm going to go back and add, almost like I'm adding a little bit of a shadow. It's just going to give a little more texture because of the shadow to this sample. And then it would be really neat to go back over it a second time and see what happens. Actually, only go over half of it. So I'm going to start here. I'm just tracing back over these lines again, but I'm only going to do it on one side of my sample. And then I'm going to compare the two. So this side compared to this side, this definitely looks like it has a rougher texture. This looks like it has a smoother texture just because I added another layer. All right, so these are all ways that we could draw or rub some texture, some implied texture. My paper still feels the same, but my eye sees these, reads these as the texture that they are. Okay, so for our last three circles, you get to go on a little walkabout in the space that you're in. There's three different ways that you can do this. If you have a magazine handy, we'll start there. I just want you to look through and find pictures that show implied texture. And right off the bat, when I look at the cover of this magazine, these flowers right here really grab my attention. They look very feathery and soft. So you can see I've already cut some out. I actually cut out some of these flowers and glued them onto my paper here. As I flip through here, there's several beautiful examples of texture. Okay, so this piece of magazine paper feels the same as this piece, but the texture looks so different. Because of the highlights and the darkness of this picture, the shadows and the lines, I can totally imagine what this honeycomb would feel like. That's another great example of texture. Here's some feathery plants. Oh, here, this apple. Definitely you can see the shine on the apple from the light. That apple looks very smooth because we see how the light reflects from it. And oops, oh, here's another. So the texture of the dog here, definitely fluffy, and poor dog. I cut part of him out too and added him on my picture. If you're using a magazine and the owner would prefer that you not destroy it and cut pictures from it, then you could simply take this circle and you could write flower, fur, honeycomb, because you remember, you've seen them, you know what you're talking about. So just write the words in if you can't actually cut from the magazine. So one example or one option would be to find implied texture in the magazine and add it to your texture study. Another one would be to go out in your environment and find 3 things with different texture. Here's what I found when I went out. 3 different leaves. This one I used for my rubbing earlier. It's smooth, but I can definitely feel these lines, and I can also see them. I see where the light hits them and the darkness. It has shadow. It's smooth, but it has some rough texture to it as well, or bumpy texture, I should say, especially compared to this leaf that totally reflects the light and is completely smooth. I feel no bumps or rough in the texture of this. So 2 different textures on these leaves. And then this very feathery looking leaf here. This one, probably less that I'm seeing from the light in texture and more from the line. It has these really feathery, flowy lines to it that show me that it has a very light texture. So, I mean, these would totally fill these 3 spots. You don't have to glue natural materials on because they'll get dry and brittle and crumble, but take a look at them, lay them out, compare them, see how they're the same, how they're different. Why are they different? Is it the shadow and the highlight, or is it the lines that are involved in it that make it look different? All right, and the last one would be to draw what you see. Here's what I mean by that. You'll hear me say this many times this year. To draw what you see is to not draw what you think you see, but to draw what you actually see. And here's what I mean. This is all observation. I mentioned earlier that I had on some pants. They kind of have a texture like a jean would. And when I look really close at what makes my pants feel this rougher texture, I notice that there's a lot of very small lines close together. So I would represent that on my paper. And then I looked again very closely. I'm like, okay, there's not just lines going this way. There's also these little lines going the other way where the fabric's been woven together. They're very short lines, very small. I'm actually having to enlarge it on my paper because they're so small. But I would draw what I see. In real life, I don't think my jeans feel quite as rough as what I'm drawing, but that's why we're practicing. That's what we're getting. So I am drawing what I see. Here would be another example of drawing what you see. If you have a block of wood nearby or something that's made out of wood, I know I mentioned that my table has wood in it, I can trace some of the lines in my wood. Or not trace them, I'm sorry, I can draw them onto my paper. They're kind of this overlapping thing, but then every once in a while, there's a swirl. And then the lines tend to go around the swirl. So if you were to look at a piece of wood near you and you started to draw what you see, you would end up with a wood pattern. That one's kind of a fun one to do. Okay, and then maybe try something else. Try something as simple as a paper towel. Maybe the sock that you're wearing probably has some good texture to it. Look around and see what other texture you could add to the third. So for these last 3 circles, you can find implied texture in pictures and add them or write down what you found. You may go out in nature and choose 3 things that show different textures and consider why they look different, not just feel different. Or you can draw what you see. Look for different textures around you and then draw what you see. Draw the lines that you see. Draw the shadow and the shape that you see and try to draw the texture onto your paper. Remember, we want to keep these papers in our art portfolio. We're going to be pulling them out to use on a future project. I hope that you guys had fun with this. I really enjoyed exploring texture myself. I look forward to seeing you guys again next week.